So Code Vein has some interesting DLC, and I'll be talking about this kind of as the full package, as well as the more interesting thing to me, which is, what is Code Vein's connection to God Eater? This game's DLC is separated into 3 packs, which you can buy individually, or you can buy together with the expansion pass. Each pack has a small area to explore with mini-bosses, some new blood codes, and a few vestiges to dig up. The big attraction, of course, is the bosses at the end. These 3 are the most challenging in the game, but for me they are also the most intriguing when looking at the overall world of Code Vein. The 3 packs are the Hellfire Knight, the Frozen Empress, and the Lord of Thunder. As I said before, these feature, in my opinion, the most challenging boss fights within the game. Now for the overall gameplay.
Map of the depths. Let's take it to Davis.
Still, the missions with him were fun.
The new areas featured within the DLC packs are fine. I would call them serviceable at best. Code Vein isn't exactly winning any awards for the most unique traversal or anything like that. The areas aren't bad, but they aren't gonna blow you away either. Even on the visual side, most of these are similar to landscapes that you traverse in the main game. Finding the vestiges is pretty easy, and mini-bosses can be a little challenging due to the fact that they do a lot more damage than any enemies in the non-DLC portion of the game. But this is the standard for all 3 areas. You fight some mini-bosses, gather the vestiges, and then you go and fight the big boss at the end. You also don't technically have to do any of this, you could just go fight the boss if you want. The areas and the exploration, for me, are not the main attraction of the DLC anyways. Before we get into the bosses, I wanted to talk very shortly about the vestiges. The vestiges are presented in a very unique way. Or not unique, but a little more unique than Code Vein's original vestiges in their game. They tell a specific story surrounding Jack, at least for the main one that you're collecting. Although there are some interesting abilities you can gain from them, overall I didn't use this vestige or the blood code at all. There are a few vestiges you can gain by completing the boss fights in specific ways that I didn't do because I have no patience for these kind of challenges. Now the first of the DLC bosses is the Hellfire Knight. This guy is tougher than any bosses in the base game. And if you're a God Eater fan like me, you'll notice that this boss moves very similarly to the Hannibal. In some ways it's the exact same, in fact. Despite this, you'll likely find this to be a greater challenge than Hannibal's incarnation in his own original game. And that goes for pretty much all these bosses. To spoil a bit of what I'm going to talk about, these bosses are all variants of God Eater enemies. Anyways, Mr. Hellfire Knight is kind of difficult. More like he's difficult compared to Code Vein's own bosses. The overall boss fight is pretty telegraphed, just like Hannibal is in God Eater, and I do obviously have a pretty heavy advantage from being able to recognize some of his attack patterns from God Eater. But even then, the fight itself only feels kind of annoying because most of Code Vein's fights do not have these massive HP bars. In the moment, I found the fight to be kind of frustrating, but looking back, it's not as bad. The number of attempts it took me to beat this boss fight still remains in the single digits. It really just takes a little bit of time to figure it out. And I'm not going to review the challenges. Looking at them, some of them are just grade A bullshit. And it's not really worth attempting unless you really have the time and perseverance, which I have neither. Moving on from that, let's talk about this one is a variant of Marduk, which is weird since Marduk is primarily fire, but whatever. This fight is probably the easiest of the 3 in my eyes. The Frozen Empress has 2 of these funky floating pillar things around her. Taking those out is key to the process. While the fight itself doesn't really feel as hard compared to the Fire Knight, letting those things do her bidding will only make the later stages a bit more annoying. And like I said, the fight feels okay. It's not easy per se, but it's not hard. I really don't have a lot to say here. This fight honestly ended a lot faster than I expected, and it really only took me about 3 tries. My attachment to Marduk is also significantly lower than Hannibal, but the fight really isn't as bad as the other 2. The Frozen Empress also kind of feels like an HP sponge like other DLC bosses, But I'm struggling to find the balance, because without a proper HP pool, these fights would just be much easier. But the excessive HP also makes these fights feel like they drag on for a bit too long. Okay, enough with the wishy-washy, let's move on to... This big, weird-looking lug is based on the Vajra, I think. That said, his attacks are a lot less similar compared to the other two. The fight itself is probably the most annoying to me. I felt as though the HP pool tested my patience, and the fight itself was just a little bit irritating. At the end of the day, it's a matter of learning. God Eater is a game where if you don't know the patterns, you'll get pummeled. Diauspida, the game's first real knowledge check in my eyes, is a tough fight, especially if you don't know how he works. But once you learn his patterns, the fight itself is actually a walk in the park. In the end, my experience with the Lord of Thunder was an unexpected victory. Did I earn it? Yeah, I did. And you know what, I complain and complain about it, but I found this one guy who one-shot the damn thing, so I guess it truly is a skill issue.
What is that thing?
I debated about making a separate video for this part, but I realize I don't have a ton to say without the DLC being here. While this DLC is a nod to God Eater fans in some ways, we can also attribute this to Code Vein taking place in the same universe as God Eater. Now you could technically say that it's not confirmed, which is true. However, there's a lot of stuff pointing to the fact that this does take place in that universe. Not just Diauspida appearing in the cutscene, not just the references to God Eater within the Code Vein boss fight, but if you listen to Mito's speech, he pretty much explains that the world outside of the mist is also overrun by monsters, and what other world is like that than the God Eater world? And Diauspida showing up really is just the icing on the cake. If you want, I wouldn't call it further potential proof, but more potential evidence that this could take place in God Eater's world. Code Vein very likely takes place in the US. I mean, the shattered skyscrapers and everything, I think there are other things pointing to that fact, but it seems to be the case. And the God Eater franchise, as far as I know, has never touched on the US, only Europe and Japan, at least in the main parts of the game. It's also likely that Code Vein takes place at least a little bit before God Eater 1. So it's entirely possible that Fenrir is not totally aware of what's happening in the US, and it's just not worth it to take the trip over here, because why would you at that point? You're so busy defending yourselves from every world-ending apocalypse threat that the Origami come up with. Regardless, I would like to see what comes next, whether it be in the form of God Eater or Code Vein. I assume Code Vein will probably take place directly after the end of the first game, if they made a sequel. Meanwhile, God Eater 4 would likely take place after 3, which is way into the future, where you probably wouldn't even touch on Code Vein stuff. And to be blunt, I don't think the DLC was worth it at the price that they launched it at. This entire thing was $30, and that's pretty much only good if you're gonna 100% the content and the challenges. Otherwise, it's just fine. Nothing bad, but it's expensive. There's no additional story stuff. You get additional blood codes, but some of it's locked behind these challenges, which are just, in my eyes, not worth it. But without any additional new story, besides these little chunks from the Vestiges, it's just not that worth it to me. Like, you don't even get characters reacting to the bosses in, like, a cutscene or something. Even if you bring Jack, who is mainly involved in the Vestige world, for these, he doesn't really, you don't get a cutscene for it. So, my general thoughts on this DLC are, it's worth it if you're looking for more gameplay. Even if you care about the God Eater reference stuff, it's not that worth it. But I'm also 5 years late to the party. If you can find this on sale, which you probably can, I'd say it's worth it around the sale prices. And you can let me know your thoughts on Code Vein's DLC in the comments down below. As always, you can leave a like if you enjoyed the video, and subscribe to the channel for more things anime RPG related, and hopefully at some point in the near future, God Eater or Code Vein related. So, thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Whatever that may be.
Power!
That's it! Stay on it!
Seeker! Wind!
We've got to hit the other spots too.